The forest has a way of keeping secrets. You can stand in the middle of a national park, surrounded by towering trees that have been here for centuries, and feel as though the land itself is watching, waiting, and remembering. Every trail, every stone, every shadow holds a story. Some of those stories are told, campfire legends, ranger accounts, hikers' journals, but others are buried deep, hidden in the silence of the woods. Tonight, we're going to step into one of those stories, a true crime mystery that has haunted investigators, baffled families, and left more questions than answers. These are the unexplained disappearances in America's national parks, places meant for adventure and beauty but shadowed by secrets that never let go. Imagine this: you're with a group of friends on a warm summer morning. The sky is open, the air is clear, and the trail stretches ahead of you. Birds echo in the distance, a river cuts through the land with its steady song, and everything feels safe, even ordinary. You stop to tie your shoe, adjust your backpack, maybe look up at the sunlight spilling through the trees, and then, when you look back up, your friend is gone, not just a few steps ahead, not calling out, not rustling in the brush, gone as though the forest swallowed them whole. That is the reality faced by families whose loved ones stepped into a park and never stepped back out again. It's easy to assume there's always a clear answer. Maybe someone slipped and fell, maybe they lost their footing, or maybe they simply got lost, but the truth is far stranger and far darker. These cases aren't just about people vanishing. They're about the details that don't add up, the tracks that lead nowhere, the possessions found in places that make no sense, and the unsettling silence that surrounds the final moments before someone disappears. Rangers, detectives, search teams, and volunteers comb through miles of rugged terrain, using helicopters, dogs, and maps, but sometimes there is nothing left to find, not a body, not a piece of clothing, not even a clue. In the heart of these stories are the people, the hikers, campers, children, hunters, and seasoned outdoorsmen who went missing. They are sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, friends and neighbors. Real human beings with plans, laughter, and memories who simply vanished into the wild. And behind them are families who wait by the phone for news that never comes, who drive across states to stand at ranger stations, who wander through trails calling the names of those they love. The pain of not knowing becomes its own prison, one built of unanswered questions and restless nights. National parks are vast, stretching across mountains, rivers, deserts, and forests. They are designed as sanctuaries of beauty, but the very things that make them breathtaking also make them unforgiving. The terrain is rough, the weather shifts quickly, and the distances are immense. In some areas, a person can disappear within minutes, slipping beyond sight lines or sound. And yet, the sheer number of cases, the patterns that emerge, and the strange consistencies between disappearances raise questions that are not so easily explained by nature alone. Consider the chilling pattern of young children vanishing when they were only steps away from their parents, found days later miles from where they were last seen, sometimes in places too treacherous for them to realistically reach on their own. Think of experienced hikers, people who knew the land, who carried maps and supplies, disappearing without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of injury or struggle. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the eerie silences and strange reports from those who were nearby, sounds that suddenly stopped, birds that no longer chirped, or the overwhelming sense that something unseen was watching. One story that captures this haunting mystery is about a young man named Daniel. He wasn't a reckless traveler or a novice hiker. He had grown up camping, fishing, and exploring trails with his family. By the time he was 24, he was confident outdoors, often leading trips with friends. On a crisp autumn morning, Daniel set out with two close friends on a familiar route inside one of the most visited national parks. They laughed as they walked, pointing out tracks in the dirt, joking about who would spot the next landmark. Everything felt ordinary, even routine, but within a few hours, ordinary turned to unimaginable. According to his friends, Daniel was only a few feet ahead when he rounded a bend. They expected to see him just beyond the curve, but when they reached the spot, he was gone. No call, no sign of distress, no visible footprints breaking off the path. They called out his name, thinking he had stepped into the brush for a quick stop, but the woods answered only with silence. Minutes stretched into hours. Panic set in. By nightfall, search and rescue teams were called. Rangers swept the area, helicopters circled overhead with spotlights, dogs tracked scents, but the forest gave nothing back. Days passed. Daniel's family flew in, joining the search with hope that dwindled each morning. They scoured ridges, climbed rocky slopes, waded streams. They found nothing, not his backpack, not his jacket, not even the water bottle he always carried. It was as though he had walked into a doorway invisible to everyone else, leaving no trace of his passage. Investigators marked the disappearance as unresolved. His case joined a growing list of others, stories that began in daylight with laughter and ended in shadows with silence. These disappearances stir up more than fear. They stir up theories. Some believe it's the harsh environment claiming lives, the simple truth that nature is unpredictable. Others whisper about foul play, about crimes hidden beneath the cover of wilderness, about predators, human or otherwise, who know the land better than their victims. And then there are those who believe something stranger is at work, forces we don't understand, phenomena that science can't quite explain. The idea that the wilderness might hold not just beauty but mystery beyond comprehension. As you listen, keep in mind that these are not just campfire tales designed to spook or entertain. These are real people. Their faces once smiled in photographs, their voices once filled kitchens and living rooms. And their families are still waiting, still wondering, still haunted by the words "last seen." One ranger, after years of experience, once admitted off record that certain disappearances don't make sense, even to seasoned searchers. He spoke of areas combed dozens of times where no sign was found, only for something small, like a shoe or a jacket, to suddenly appear later as if placed there deliberately. He talked about the unsettling feeling, during some searches, that the forest itself was too quiet, as though holding back its secrets. And while no official reports mention anything unusual, those who have spent years on the front lines searching say the same thing again and again. Some of these cases don't add up. And that is where the mystery deepens. Because once you begin to trace the timelines, compare the circumstances, and hear the voices of those left behind, you realize this is not just a story of people getting lost. This is a story of patterns, of unanswered questions, of human lives slipping into the unknown under conditions that defy easy explanation. Tonight, as we step into this true crime mystery, we are not just following footsteps on a trail. We are stepping into the silence that follows, the questions that echo in families' hearts, and the haunting possibility that some disappearances may never be solved. And yet, with each retelling, with each detail unearthed, with each voice that refuses to be silenced, the mystery remains alive, waiting to be confronted. But the question we must carry forward is this: what really happened in those moments of vanishing? Was it simply the vastness of nature, or was something else at work? Something hidden, something unspoken, something that still lingers in the shadows of the national parks. And as you hear what comes next, prepare yourself. Because once we step deeper into this story, the line between what can be explained and what cannot will begin to blur. And the deeper we go, the more you may begin to feel that same unsettling truth, that the forest does not always give back what it takes. The story is only beginning, but to understand why these disappearances are so haunting, we have to step back and look at the world in which they happen. A national park is not just a piece of land. It is a living, breathing wilderness that stretches for miles upon miles, often untouched by human hands. When people enter, they carry a sense of freedom, a longing to connect with something larger than themselves. Families bring children to see waterfalls, hikers seek peaks for breathtaking views, campers gather around firelight to share food and laughter, but beneath that beauty lies danger. The same forest that offers peace also hides risks, and the same trails that promise adventure can also become corridors of fear. To really feel the weight of these mysteries, picture the parks as they are at night. The sun sinks behind mountains, the sky glows deep blue, and then blackness falls heavy over the land. The trees sway in a rhythm you can't hear, and shadows seem to grow longer than they should. The call of an owl echoes. A twig snaps nearby, yet nothing is visible. The darkness presses in so fully that a flashlight beam barely makes a dent. Out there, in that stillness, a person can feel very small, very alone, and very vulnerable. That is the stage where countless stories of vanishing begin. When Daniel disappeared, his family thought the search would end quickly. After all, he was only a short distance from his friends when he vanished. They believed he would be found resting under a tree, or maybe injured but alive, waiting for help. But as hours turned to days, it became clear this was not going to be simple. The official search included dozens of rangers, volunteer hikers, helicopters, and even thermal imaging. Dogs tracked his scent for a while, but then it stopped in the middle of the trail, as though the path itself had erased him. No broken branches suggested he went into the woods. No footprints continued into the soil. It was as if he had stepped into the air and disappeared. For his parents, the nightmare was not only that Daniel was gone, but that nobody could explain how. They were shown maps covered in grids, marked where teams had searched again and again. They were told about the hours logged, the number of eyes and ears who had scoured the forest, the technology that scanned the land. Still, there was nothing, and the absence of evidence became heavier than any explanation could be. This is not an isolated case. Over the years, families across the country have reported eerily similar stories. A child steps just out of sight and is gone. An experienced hunter separates briefly from his group and is never seen again. A hiker walks ahead on a well-worn path, and within minutes the trail is empty. These are not people who went into unknown jungles or foreign deserts. These are disappearances happening in some of the most visited, well-traveled national parks in America. The mystery deepens when you hear about the belongings left behind. Sometimes, searchers find shoes placed neatly beside a rock, or clothing discovered miles away from where the person was last seen. In certain cases, bodies are eventually found in areas that had already been searched multiple times. Investigators are left scratching their heads, wondering how an object or a person could appear in a location already combed with trained eyes. To the families, these discoveries are devastating because they bring no closure, only more questions. Daniel's friends were questioned repeatedly. Authorities wanted to know if they had argued, if there was any chance Daniel had wandered off deliberately, if perhaps something darker had happened between them. But each of them told the same story again and again. He was just ahead of them, smiling, walking, moving like he always did, and then he was gone. They insisted there was no sound of struggle, no sign of running, no scream in the air. Just silence, the kind of silence that feels unnatural in a forest filled with life. Investigators ruled out many possibilities, but the lack of evidence left nothing to confirm. His disappearance was marked as unresolved, joining countless others in the shadowy records of the wilderness. Families of the missing sometimes gather, connected by grief and confusion. They compare stories, hoping to find patterns, clues, or even comfort in the shared pain. Again and again, they repeat the same questions. How could someone vanish so close to others? Why are there no tracks? Why are there no signs of struggle? To understand why these mysteries feel so heavy, it helps to know how search operations work in national parks. When someone is reported missing, rangers spring into action quickly. They establish a base of operations, gather volunteers, set up radios, and divide the land into grids. Helicopters sweep from above, dogs sniff the trails, and teams push into difficult terrain. These are not casual efforts. Hundreds of hours are poured into finding a single person, and yet, in these unexplained cases, it's as though the land itself hides what it wants to keep. Theories swirl around these stories. Some point to accidents, falls, drowning, hypothermia. Others believe foul play is involved, that crimes are hidden under the cover of wilderness where evidence is hard to preserve. And some whisper about things stranger still, forces beyond ordinary explanation, things that might live in the deep silence of the woods. What is undeniable is that the disappearances continue and the families left behind struggle with a kind of grief that is harder than death, the grief of not knowing. Daniel's mother once described waiting by the phone during the search. Each ring jolted her heart with both hope and dread. She replayed her last conversation with him over and over, clinging to his words, his voice, trying to memorize every detail. His father walked the trails himself, calling out his son's name, listening to the echo bounce back from the trees. He described it as shouting into a hollow, a place where sound seemed to vanish just as quickly as his son had. Other families share similar memories. A father remembers turning his back for only a few seconds to take a photograph, only to realize his child was gone. A brother recalls waving at his sibling from across a field, and when he looked again, there was nothing but grass swaying in the wind. These memories replay endlessly in their minds, like broken records, each time asking the same question: what happened in that exact moment of vanishing? The human heart craves closure, even painful closure, because it offers an ending, but in these cases there is no ending, only an unfinished sentence. Time moves forward, but the questions remain stuck in place. Friends grow older, families change, seasons shift, but the absence stays the same, echoing year after year. When you walk the trails where someone disappeared, you can feel it. The air feels heavier, the silence deeper. Some rangers admit that certain areas carry an eerie weight, places where people pause without knowing why, where sound seems to travel differently, where you cannot shake the feeling that you are not alone. These are the places where the wilderness reminds you it is still wild, still untamed, still capable of swallowing secrets whole. Investigators keep files on these disappearances. The folders contain maps, photos, witness statements, and official notes. Yet the thicker the file becomes, the less sense it often makes. Patterns emerge, people disappearing near water or close to boulder fields or in areas where compasses behave strangely, but no single explanation ties it all together. And so, the questions grow heavier, the mysteries deeper. Families sometimes return to the parks year after year, holding small memorials even without graves. They leave flowers, notes, or personal items, creating their own sacred spaces in the wilderness. They hope in some small way their loved ones can feel remembered. For them, the park is no longer just a destination for beauty. It is the place where their lives split in two, before and after the disappearance. And still, the disappearances continue. The parks remain vast, wild, and indifferent. Visitors arrive each season, unaware of the shadows hidden in the history of the land. They walk the same trails, stand at the same overlooks, camp in the same valleys. Some may even pass the very spot where someone vanished, never knowing the weight that lingers there. This is the haunting truth of these national park mysteries. They are not isolated. They are not neatly explained. They are threads in a web that stretches wide, pulling at families, communities, and investigators alike. And as we follow these threads, we step further into the unknown, deeper into the silence, closer to the unsettling possibility that some questions are not meant to be answered. Because the forest does not always give back what it takes, and the deeper we go, the more we realize the story has only just begun. The conflict at the center of these disappearances is not just the fact that people go missing. It is the silence that follows. Silence from the land, silence from the evidence that should be there but isn't, silence from the investigations that eventually grow cold. It is this silence that becomes unbearable for the families and haunting for those who dare to look closer. The conflict lives in the gap between what we know and what we cannot explain, and in that gap grows fear, frustration, suspicion, and mystery. Daniel's case left his family torn in two directions. On one side, they wanted to believe it was an accident, that somehow he had gotten lost, injured, or swept away in a way that left no trace. That explanation, as painful as it was, at least made sense within the boundaries of nature. On the other side, however, there were the questions that could not be ignored. Why were there no tracks? Why did his scent stop suddenly in the middle of a trail? Why did the forest feel different after he was gone? That split became their conflict, one that mirrored the larger struggle behind all these vanishings. Do you trust the rational explanations, or do you admit that something stranger might be happening in the shadows of the parks? As weeks passed with no answers, Daniel's parents were contacted by other families who had lived through similar tragedies. They told their stories, one after another, each echoing the same eerie notes. A child who vanished while chasing butterflies only a few yards from her mother. A hunter who left his group to check a ridge and never came back. A hiker who was last seen near a lake and whose belongings were found miles away in a location so remote searchers could not understand how he had gotten there. Each story became a thread in a tapestry of unease, weaving together into something far larger than one missing man. Among these families were people who had spent years digging into the mystery. Some of them kept binders filled with articles, maps, and handwritten notes. They had marked patterns of disappearances, clusters near water, areas where compasses spun, valleys where strange fog lingered without reason. They were not professionals, but they carried the intensity of people desperate for answers. When they sat with Daniel's parents, they whispered about the things no one wanted to say out loud, that maybe there was more to these vanishings than nature or crime. Maybe there were forces in the wilderness that we simply do not understand. Of course, not everyone agreed. Rangers and investigators pushed back against such theories, insisting that the wilderness was dangerous enough without adding ghosts or legends. They pointed to cliffs, rivers, sudden storms, and wildlife. They reminded people that the parks draw millions of visitors each year and that most leave without harm. Yet even they admitted, quietly, that some cases were baffling. A ranger who had served for 20 years once confessed to Daniel's father that he hated certain calls, the ones where someone was last seen just around the corner. Those were the ones that never made sense. He said it always felt like chasing shadows. As the months rolled on, Daniel's case turned colder, but the questions burned hotter. His friends, once inseparable, began to drift apart. The memory of that day gnawed at them, pulling them into guilt and suspicion. They replayed every moment over and over, trying to spot what they had missed. Did they hear a sound out of place? Did they look away too long? Each carried their own version of blame, and the weight of it became too heavy for their friendship to bear. They spoke less, avoided each other, and when they did meet, there was only silence and unspoken questions between them. The conflict deepened when local newspapers picked up the story. Some framed it as a tragic accident, while others hinted at darker possibilities. Reporters pressed the family with questions. Did Daniel have enemies? Was he hiding something? Could this have been foul play disguised as disappearance? Those questions cut like knives, especially when strangers began to speculate online. In chat rooms and forums dedicated to true crime, theories multiplied like wildfire. Some insisted Daniel had staged his own disappearance. Others said his friends knew more than they were admitting. and a smaller group whispered about the pattern, about how his story fit too perfectly with dozens of others in parks across the country. What began as one family's tragedy had now become part of a larger conversation, one that reached far beyond their small town. And with that attention came more conflict. Some families of other missing people welcomed the spotlight, believing it could push authorities to take their cases seriously. Others resented it, afraid that their loved ones' stories were being lumped into a mystery that might never have answers. Tension grew between those who clung to rational explanations and those who leaned into the unknown. Meanwhile, the land itself remained unchanged. The same trails where Daniel walked were filled with hikers again by the next season. Families snapped photos, children played by streams, and campers built fires under the stars. To them, the forest was still a place of beauty and wonder, but for those who knew the story, the same ground felt haunted. Every bend in the path carried weight, every shadow seemed to whisper, every silence carried the question, what really happened here? As if to intensify the conflict, new disappearances were reported. A young woman named Claire went missing less than 100 miles from where Daniel had vanished. She was last seen taking photos near a waterfall, her tripod still standing on the rocks when rangers arrived. Her camera was recovered, but the final image she took showed nothing unusual, just rushing water and mist. No trace of her was ever found. Weeks later, an older man disappeared while mushroom hunting deep in the woods. His truck was parked neatly at the trailhead, his gear still inside. Searchers combed the area for weeks, yet not even a shoe turned up. These new cases reignited speculation. Was there a hidden predator moving through the parks? Could a single person or group be responsible for multiple vanishings, slipping through the wilderness undetected? Some investigators doubted it, pointing out the vast distances between the cases. Others wondered if something darker was being overlooked, something capable of leaving no trace at all. The subplots multiplied. Some families pushed for federal investigations, hoping for new eyes and resources. Others turned to psychics, desperate for answers in the absence of evidence. Internet sleuths built maps of disappearances, drawing red lines between cases, connecting dots that official investigators refused to acknowledge. And all the while, the conflict between rational explanation and unsettling mystery grew sharper, dividing communities, tearing at families, and gnawing at the minds of those who could not stop asking why. Daniel's mother found herself caught between hope and despair. She would sit for hours staring at the trail maps, tracing her finger along the lines, trying to imagine her son's last steps. At night, she dreamed of him calling out from somewhere just beyond reach. She began to believe that the forest was holding him, not gone but hidden, as if trapped between worlds. His father, by contrast, rejected such ideas. He clung to the belief that answers could be found, that evidence existed somewhere, that human eyes had simply missed what was there. Their conflict became a quiet fracture in their marriage, each grieving in different ways, each holding to different kinds of hope. And yet, through all this, no resolution came. The files remained open but cold. The trails remained open to hikers. The forest remained silent, and the questions continued to multiply. Was it nature, crime, or something else entirely? Were the parks hiding dangers no one wanted to admit? Or were they doorways to mysteries far beyond human understanding? The tension never eased, only deepened, because every time a new disappearance was reported, the old wounds reopened. Every new face that vanished into the wilderness reminded families that they were not alone, but it also reminded them that answers were still as far away as ever. The conflict, in the end, was not just with the land or the authorities or the theories. The conflict was with the very nature of mystery itself, with the unbearable weight of not knowing. And as night fell over the forest again, the silence thickened, the shadows stretched longer, and the land waited, holding secrets it had no intention of giving back. The story was not finished, not even close. I've carried the story forward, exploring the main conflict, subplots, and perspectives while keeping the tension unresolved. This section builds suspense without resolution, maintaining humans, entered storytelling and weaving in natural keywords like true crime, unexplained disappearances, national parks, hikers, search teams, wilderness mysteries. By the time a year had passed since Daniel's disappearance, the story had grown far beyond his family. It had become a whisper in hiking communities, a caution told around campfires, a warning posted on forums where travelers swapped stories of the unexplained. His name was added to lists of people who had gone missing in national parks, a list that grew longer with each passing season, and as that list grew, so did the tension. Something felt different, heavier, as though the wilderness itself was tightening its grip on those who dared step into it. Claire's disappearance near the waterfall still echoed in the news when another case emerged, this time in a remote corner of the mountains. A group of friends had gone backpacking, experienced outdoorsmen who knew the land well. They split up briefly near a lake, each taking a different route around the shoreline before meeting on the far side. 3 made it across, 1 never did. His pack, his jacket, his phone, gone with him. The lake was searched. Divers combed the waters, but the body was never recovered. Witnesses said the strangest thing wasn't his vanishing, but the moment before it. Birds went silent, the wind stopped. The stillness was so sudden, so unnatural, that the others remembered the hair standing up on their arms. They said it felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Stories like these fanned the flames of fear. Families began to speak louder, demanding answers. Why did search efforts end so quickly? Why weren't cases connected? Why wasn't anyone willing to admit that the patterns looked too precise, too deliberate, too chilling? Officials responded with the same phrases: rugged terrain, harsh conditions, unpredictable wilderness. Yet behind closed doors, even some searchers admitted that not all the pieces fit. The suspense only grew when certain belongings began to surface in ways no one could explain. A shoe placed neatly on a boulder miles from where the victim was last seen. A jacket draped across a branch in an area already searched multiple times. A camera resting against a rock, undamaged, though the person who carried it had disappeared without a sound. These small discoveries did not bring comfort, they brought dread, because instead of answering questions they deepened the mystery. They made it feel as though someone, or something, was toying with the searchers, showing just enough to unsettle them but never enough to solve the case. The families gathered again, creating a small, fragile community built on loss and unanswered questions. Some leaned into each other for support, others clashed in their desperation. A mother who lost her child argued fiercely with a man whose brother had vanished, each convinced the cause was different. One swearing it was human predators, the other insisting something beyond explanation was at work. These arguments revealed the raw nerves everyone carried. The conflict was no longer only with the wilderness, but with each other. Each theory, each suspicion pulled them further apart, as though the mystery itself was feeding on their division. Meanwhile, those closest to Daniel still struggled with the memories of that day. His friends had stopped speaking openly, but each was haunted by the same moment, the bend in the trail where he was there 1 second and gone the next. One of them admitted in a late-night conversation that he sometimes dreamed of that bend, dreamed of walking around it and finding not emptiness but something waiting. Something dark, something silent, something that stared back. He would wake with his heart pounding, drenched in sweat, unable to shake the sense that the dream wasn't only a dream, but a glimpse of what might have truly happened. The pressure reached a breaking point when a volunteer searcher went missing during an ongoing operation. He had been part of a group combing a valley, calling out the name of a missing hiker. At some point, he broke off to check a cluster of rocks just a short distance away. When the rest of the group circled back, he was gone. Radios crackled with confusion. His name was shouted into the trees. Within hours, another search began, this time for one of their own, and yet, as the sun set, no trace of him was found. For many, this was the moment the conflict became undeniable. It wasn't just the visitors, the casual hikers, or the unsuspecting campers. It was now those trained to find the missing who were themselves disappearing. The tension in the parks became palpable. Rangers noticed more visitors reporting strange sensations, sudden silences, the feeling of being watched, compasses spinning without reason. Some even described losing track of time, as though hours had passed in what felt like only minutes. These reports were not filed in official records, but they were whispered in break rooms and over coffee, where the people who worked the land admitted to each other that something was wrong. Daniel's parents, still clinging to the hope of answers, returned to the park to walk the trail again. They stopped at the bend where their son had last been seen. His mother placed a hand on the bark of a tree, closing her eyes as though she could feel something of him still lingering. His father, weary and bitter, said little, but his eyes never stopped scanning the shadows, searching for movement. They stood there for a long time, listening to the forest's silence, a silence so heavy it pressed on their hearts. It was in that moment they realized their story was not just about Daniel anymore. It was about something larger, something spreading, something that felt alive. The climax began to take shape when independent investigators, people outside official agencies, started connecting the dots in ways authorities had avoided. They mapped the disappearances across regions, circling clusters, marking patterns, drawing connections between cases separated by years and miles. What they found unsettled everyone. Many vanishings occurred near bodies of water, near boulder fields, or near areas where the land seemed to hold unusual qualities. The map looked less like random tragedy and more like a design. And once you saw the design, you couldn't unsee it. Still, no one could explain the why. Was it coincidence? Was it human predators exploiting the wilderness as cover? Was it something hidden in the land itself, natural phenomena that defied science? Or was it something stranger, something people dared only whisper about in private? Each theory carried its own weight, its own fear, its own inability to fully account for every missing detail. And then came the night when everything seemed to converge. A storm rolled over the mountains, lightning splitting the sky, rain hammering down in sheets. A small group of searchers, still working on an unresolved case, camped in the valley below. As the storm raged, one of them swore he heard voices outside the tent, faint, calling like echoes carried on the wind. Another said he saw a light moving through the trees, not like a flashlight, but something softer, stranger, glowing without a source. They huddled together, listening as the storm drowned out every sound, until finally one of them stepped outside. He never returned. That night cemented the fear that had been building for years. The parks were no longer just places of beauty and adventure. They were places of dread, places where the land itself seemed to consume the people who walked too far, lingered too long, or stumbled into something they should not have seen. The story now teetered on the edge of revelation. Families demanded answers, investigators drew closer to patterns, witnesses spoke of strange phenomena, and still the disappearances continued. The air was thick with tension, the sense that something was about to give way, that the mystery was circling toward its most intense moment, but the resolution had not yet come. The storm raged, the forests whispered, and the silence grew heavier with each missing name. And for those who stood at the edge of the trail, staring into the trees, one thought echoed again and again. Whatever is happening here, it is not finished. The story is racing toward its peak, but the secrets of the wilderness are not ready to let go. The climax waits, building in the shadows, pulling everyone deeper into the unknown, and the question remains unrelenting, inescapable. When the forest takes, why does it never give back? The storm that night seemed like the breaking point, but what came afterward revealed that the story was far from over. In the weeks following, whispers began to circulate about discoveries that had been quietly kept from the public. A park employee confided to a family member that items belonging to missing people had been found in odd places that did not match the timelines or the maps. A single hiking boot discovered wedged high in the branches of a tree. A backpack sitting in plain view on a rock ledge that had been swept by searchers many times before. These weren't just overlooked items. They felt deliberately placed, as though someone wanted them found but not understood. This revelation twisted the story in a new direction. If belongings could reappear in such strange ways, what did that mean for the missing themselves? Were they moving? Were they being moved? Or was someone playing a cruel game with the families and the searchers? The possibility that the disappearances weren't random at all, but connected by a hidden hand, escalated the fear into something sharper, more personal. Tension mounted when one of the independent investigators who had been tracking these cases claimed he was being followed. He described hearing footsteps on trails where he was alone, shadows shifting just beyond the beam of his flashlight, and voices that carried faintly through the trees though no one was there. He told a colleague that the more he dug into the disappearances, the more it felt like the wilderness was turning its attention on him. Then, one evening, while on a solo trip to map out a cluster of cases, he too vanished. His tent was found zipped, his notes left behind, his car still parked at the trailhead. His disappearance didn't just add to the mystery, it escalated it into a terrifying pattern where even those searching for answers became part of the unanswered. Families who had once argued over theories now began to unite in fear. They felt watched, as though the mystery was no longer confined to the parks, but reaching into their lives outside, strange calls in the middle of the night with nothing but static. Windows found open in homes that had been locked, items misplaced, then suddenly reappearing in odd places. Was it paranoia, grief stretching their minds thin, or was the mystery pressing closer, breaking the boundaries of the wilderness? The conflict became more desperate when a group of families decided to conduct their own search, venturing into a remote section of forest where multiple people had gone missing over the years. They went with maps, flashlights, radios, and the determination to uncover what the authorities had missed. For days they walked trails, marked trees, and documented everything they saw. But on the fourth day, one of them, a father searching for his son, wandered just a short distance from camp to gather firewood. He never returned. Panic rippled through the group. Radios crackled without response. His flashlight was later found lying on the ground, still on, but nothing else remained. The families had gone searching for answers and instead found themselves caught inside the very nightmare they were trying to escape. This second wave of vanishings introduced a chilling realization. The more people pushed against the mystery, the more the mystery seemed to push back. It wasn't only hikers or children who were disappearing. It was those who searched, those who questioned, those who dug too deeply. It felt less like random tragedy and more like escalation, as if something hidden in the parks did not want to be found. Theories spiraled even further. Some whispered about organized crime using the wilderness as cover. Others suggested there were hidden caves or passages in the land where people could be taken and hidden away. A few even believed the vanishings weren't bound by natural law at all, that something otherworldly might be opening doors and closing them without leaving a trace. Each theory clashed with the others, but all of them carried the same undercurrent of fear. Whatever was happening, it was growing bolder. The tension rose even higher when Daniel's mother received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed a forest clearing she did not recognize, but in the center of the picture was Daniel's backpack, the same one searchers had never found. The photo was blurry, grainy, as though taken with an old camera. No note was included, no explanation, only that single image. She brought it to the authorities, but they could not determine when or where it had been taken. To her, It was proof that her son was still out there, somewhere, caught in the shadow of this mystery. To others, it was a taunt, a cruel twist designed to deepen the wound. This moment changed everything. It was no longer just about vanishings in the parks. It was about the possibility that someone, or something, was actively controlling the narrative, choosing what to show, what to hide, and who would vanish next. The story was no longer just mysterious, it was becoming menacing. The stakes were higher, the fear more widespread, and the sense of inevitability thicker than ever. Every trail, every campsite, every stretch of wilderness now felt dangerous. Visitors whispered about hearing laughter at night where no one camped. Hikers reported finding strange symbols carved into trees. Rangers privately admitted that some areas of the park gave them chills, though they could not explain why. The conflict had shifted from the simple tragedy of disappearances to the terrifying possibility of an active force at work, one that knew how to take people and leave nothing but questions behind. And now, with families haunted, investigators missing, and belongings reappearing in impossible places, the story pressed harder toward its breaking point. The parks had gone from places of wonder to landscapes of fear, where each rustle in the brush carried the weight of possibility, where each shadow seemed to reach longer than it should, and where the silence itself grew so loud it seemed ready to crack. The second plot twist had become undeniable. This was no longer just about people lost in nature. This was about something, or someone deciding who stayed and who never returned. And as that truth pressed down, it carried the story closer to its climax, where the wilderness and the unknown stood waiting with secrets still locked tight. The question was no longer just why people vanished. The question had become far more chilling: who is next? The breaking point came one late autumn evening when the search for answers reached a fever pitch. Families, investigators, and a small group of journalists gathered near the edge of a remote section of the forest, where many of the disappearances had been clustered. The air was heavy, filled with both dread and determination, as though everyone present knew they were stepping into the very heart of the mystery. Radios buzzed softly, flashlights cut through the darkness, and every crack of a branch underfoot made nerves tighten. It wasn't just another search. It felt like a confrontation with something that had been lurking for far too long. They moved in teams, carefully documenting every sign they came across. Hours passed in silence until one group stumbled upon a clearing, the same one seen in the grainy photograph sent to Daniel's mother. At its center lay objects from several of the missing cases: backpacks, shoes, torn pieces of clothing, and even cameras whose batteries had long since died. Everything looked deliberately placed, almost like a shrine or warning. The discovery sent waves of fear through the group. No random accident could explain it anymore. Someone had been collecting these things. Someone had been watching. Tension broke when one of the flashlights swept across the edge of the clearing, illuminating a figure standing just beyond the tree line. For a moment, no one moved. The figure was still, silent, almost blending into the shadows. Then it turned and ran deeper into the forest. Instinct took over. Several of the searchers gave chase, stumbling over roots and branches, desperate to finally put a face to the terror that had haunted them for years. The pursuit was frantic, filled with the pounding of boots, the snapping of limbs, and the ragged sound of breath. At last, they cornered the figure in a ravine. What they found wasn't what anyone expected. It wasn't some mythical creature, nor an otherworldly being. It was a man, ragged, filthy, his eyes wide with something between fear and madness. He was clutching a small bundle of belongings, scraps of clothing, a necklace, a child's shoe. When confronted, he dropped them and tried to flee, but exhaustion overtook him. The truth began to spill out in broken, frantic words. He admitted to following hikers, to watching families, to moving belongings long after searches had ended. He confessed that he had taken advantage of the vast wilderness to stage vanishings, to create confusion, to make it seem as if the forest itself had swallowed people whole. It was a horrifying revelation. For years, while the world spun theories about the supernatural or the inexplicable, a single person had been weaving chaos in the shadows. He hadn't been responsible for every disappearance nature still claimed its share, but he had amplified the terror, ensuring that families never found closure, planting fear where there might have been only tragedy. The authorities secured him, and in the days that followed, pieces of the puzzle began to fit together. Items found in impossible places, trails gone cold, investigators suddenly targeted. It all traced back to his hand. The main conflict seemed resolved. The parks were no longer haunted by something unknowable, but by a man who had fed off fear and silence. Families grieved, but at least some found answers. The story could have ended there, with relief replacing terror. But as the investigation deepened, a final twist emerged. Among the man's hidden belongings was a camera he had taken from one of the missing. When authorities managed to recover the files, they discovered something that stopped them cold. The last image on the card wasn't of him or of the forest, but of a vast clearing lit by an eerie glow. In the distance, several figures stood, motionless, too far to be identified, and yet clearly not part of the searchers or the man himself. The timestamp on the photo was taken days after the hiker had already been declared missing. That final discovery reopened every wound. If the man was only part of the story, then what of the rest? Who were the figures in that photograph? Why did the clearing glow with a light no one could explain? Suddenly, the sense of closure slipped into doubt. Families realized that while one layer of the mystery had been unmasked, something deeper still lingered, something that had yet to reveal itself. The climax left everyone shaken. The disappearances had been explained in part. Justice had been served, but the unanswered questions refused to fade. The wilderness still held secrets, and the possibility of something far stranger than a single man remained. In the end, people left the forest with mixed emotions, grateful for resolution, but unsettled by the shadows that still stretched beyond the reach of their flashlights. And as the story closed, one chilling truth remained. Not every mystery had been solved, and sometimes the most frightening part of the unknown is realizing how much of it still waits in silence, just beyond the trees. The aftermath of the climax unfolded like the slow unraveling of a knot that had been tangled for years. In the quiet days following the arrest, the forest seemed to exhale a long, heavy breath, as if it too had been holding something back. The man was taken into custody, his confessions pieced together against years of unanswered questions. And for the first time in what felt like forever, families of the missing were given a version of the truth they had long been denied. Yet, as much as his words filled certain gaps, the discovery of that final photograph created new cracks in the ground beneath their feet. Investigators released a carefully worded statement about the case, acknowledging the role this man had played in orchestrating confusion and deepening the mystery. He admitted to watching hikers, sometimes moving their gear, other times planting belongings in places they would be found later, all to sow fear and mislead searchers. He thrived on the chaos, the not knowing, the way a whole community could be haunted by shadows. But even in his own disturbed ramblings, there were holes. When pressed about the photograph, the glowing clearing, and the indistinct figures, he grew defensive and claimed he had never seen it. He insisted that the camera had already contained those images when he found it. His tone wasn't boastful then, it was fearful, as if he himself had been disturbed by what he saw. The police couldn't confirm or deny the truth of that claim. Forensic teams analyzed the photo and declared it authentic. No manipulation, no trick of exposure. What the camera had captured was real, yet the forest itself gave no answers. When teams returned to the area with the photo in hand, they found nothing but ordinary trees, bare ground, and the silence that seemed heavier now than ever. No glowing light, no mysterious figures, only a chilling emptiness that seemed to mock the certainty everyone had hoped for. The families carried this dual weight, relief that one tormentor had been stopped, and unease that something deeper still lurked beyond human explanation. Some chose to accept the partial closure, to tell themselves that their loved ones had fallen victim to the cruelty of one man, or the unforgiving dangers of the wilderness. Others couldn't let go of the possibility that there was more, that the photograph was proof of something stranger than anyone dared to say aloud. Daniel's mother was one of those who refused to settle. She kept a copy of the photo tucked into a small notebook she carried everywhere. To her, the figures in the distance were not shadows or tricks of light. They were people, perhaps even those who had vanished, standing together in some place that existed just beyond ordinary reach. "It means they're not gone," she whispered to herself more than once, "not the way we think." Whether that was hope speaking or intuition, no one could tell. But her conviction gave her the strength to carry on, and her quiet belief offered comfort to others who still had no graves to visit, no remains to bury. The journalists who had followed the story leaned into the broader mystery. Articles and documentaries emerged, threading together the strange history of disappearances in national parks, the unnerving consistencies across decades, and the chilling idea that wilderness held more than just bears, storms, and accidents. Words like unexplained vanishings, mystery in the woods, and unsolved national park disappearances filled headlines and search bars. People wanted to know more, needed to understand how vast landscapes meant to symbolize freedom and beauty could also harbor so much darkness. For the investigators, the work didn't end with an arrest. They combed through old case files, cross-checking every disappearance against the man's movements, trying to draw clear lines between what he had orchestrated and what remained inexplicable. Some cases closed neatly, finally explained by his interference. Others, though, resisted any answer, and those were the ones that kept even the most seasoned detectives awake at night. They began to accept that no single culprit could account for everything. The wilderness itself, indifferent and immense, claimed its own victims, and maybe, though none would say it on record, there were other forces at play too. As months turned into a year, the national conversation shifted. Families of the missing pushed for better safety protocols in parks, more thorough search procedures, and greater public awareness. Their loss became a call for action, not just to honor those gone, but to protect future travelers. Park rangers, often the first to search when someone vanished, were given new tools, better training, and a louder voice in warning visitors about the dangers. Yet even they admitted, in quiet conversations around campfires or ranger stations, that the forest still held places that felt wrong, places they would rather not linger after dark. For those who had been there the night of the arrest, the memory never left. The figure fleeing through the trees, the clearing of belongings like a stage set, the trembling man who confessed and then shivered at the mention of the photograph, all of it played over in their minds. Some sought therapy to deal with the trauma. Others turned to writing or speaking, sharing their story with anyone who would listen. Their words became cautionary tales, reminders of how little control humans truly had when stepping into wild lands that operated on their own terms. And then there was the question of the photograph. Copies circulated among researchers, paranormal investigators, and curious onlookers. Some claimed it was evidence of a hidden community, people who had chosen to live off-grid, unseen and unknown. Others insisted it was something supernatural, perhaps an echo of those who had disappeared, caught on camera in a place where time and space folded differently. Skeptics dismissed it as an optical illusion, a play of light and distance. But no explanation silenced the unease it carried. Daniel's mother held on to her hope, but privately she admitted to one of the journalists that the photo haunted her dreams. She dreamed of her son standing in that clearing, his face both familiar and strange, his hand reaching out as though inviting her to step closer. Every time she woke before she could reach him, her heart breaking anew. Yet she chose to see even that as a gift, a reminder that love stretched beyond the limits of what could be explained. For the wider world, the case became both warning and wonder. Visitors to national parks increased, drawn by the beauty but also by the mystery. True crime enthusiasts, hikers, families, and investigators alike carried the story in their minds. When they walked trails, they did so with more caution, more reverence, sometimes pausing to listen for sounds in the underbrush that might mean nothing, or everything. The forests didn't change, but people did. They entered with a sense that they were stepping into something older, bigger, and far more complex than they could ever fully understand, and that may have been the true takeaway. Not that every disappearance had an answer, or that every mystery could be solved, but that humans live in a world still filled with shadows and silence, places where certainty doesn't reach. The man in custody gave some answers, but the photograph reminded everyone that not all puzzles are meant to be solved. The unknown lingers not to torment, but to remind us of humility, of the fragility of control, and of the awe that comes from facing the wild as it truly is. The story ended where it began, in the vast expanse of the parks themselves. Trails continued to wind through towering trees and over rugged mountains. Rivers still carved their way through valleys, and wildlife roamed undisturbed. Families still came with tents and laughter. Couples still hiked hand in hand, and lone travelers still sought solitude beneath endless skies. But beneath it all, woven into the fabric of the land, was the knowledge of what had happened, the memory of those who had disappeared, and the cautionary whispers carried on the wind. For those who had lived through it, the resolution was bittersweet. Justice had come, but not fully. Questions had been answered, but others had bloomed in their place. Closure existed, but it was incomplete, tinged with mystery, and perhaps that was fitting, for a story born in wilderness should never be too neat, too tidy. It should leave echoes, lingering traces like footprints that fade but never entirely vanish. As the sun set over the mountains one final evening, Daniel's mother stood at the trail head where his journey had ended. She pressed the photograph against her chest, eyes scanning the tree line as though expecting him to emerge, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. She whispered a prayer not of anger or desperation, but of love. Then she turned and walked away, not in defeat, but in quiet acceptance that some stories remain unfinished. The mystery of unexplained disappearances in national parks may never fully unravel, but perhaps it doesn't need to. Perhaps its purpose is to remind us that the wilderness, in all its beauty and danger, still holds secrets that command respect. And so the story rests, not with every answer given, but with every heart touched by its telling, and every mind left to wonder what still lingers in the silence between the trees, and in that wondering, the mystery lives on.